August 1945. The war in the Pacific had ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than any bombardment. Beyond the wire fences of a U.S. internment compound in Luzon, a thin haze of dust hung in the humid morning air. Rows of canvas tents trembled in the wind. Inside them sat dozens of Japanese women, former nurses, clerks, and civilian volunteers captured when the islands fell. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by coarse khaki and worn sandals. Their eyes, once sharp with discipline, now carried the dull reflection of defeat. They had expected punishment, hunger, perhaps even death. Instead, an American truck arrived that morning, not with rifles, but with crates of paper and small tins of ink. A young U.S. Army sergeant stepped forward, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't shout orders. He simply placed a pen on the rough wooden table before one of the women. "You can write," he said quietly. "Letters to your families. The Red Cross will deliver them." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as the first pen touched paper, the camp, once silent as stone, filled with the fragile sound of writing. The human war had begun to heal itself. When the Empire of Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in years. The guns fell silent across the Pacific. But beneath the relief lay something far more complex. A shattered nation, millions displaced, and countless prisoners scattered across islands and continents. In the final months of the war, Japan's military collapse was total. American B-29s had reduced Tokyo to ashes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been erased in seconds. Convoys were gone, supply lines severed, and soldiers, along with thousands of military nurses, clerks, and civilian auxiliaries, found themselves stranded on distant fronts with no hope of evacuation. For many Japanese women captured in the Philippines, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, captivity began not with surrender, but with survival. They were not the fierce image of the wartime propagandist, but secretaries, translators, nurses who had followed their husbands, brothers, or duty into occupied territories. When the front collapsed, they were left behind, confused, exhausted, and terrified of what the Americans might do. Their fear was not unfounded. For years, the Pacific War had been defined by an unforgiving brutality on both sides. From Bataan to Guadalcanal, the Japanese fought to the last man, often refusing surrender. American troops had learned to expect ambushes, suicides, and booby traps from prisoners. Hatred was not just common, it was tactical. Propaganda on both sides dehumanized the enemy to the point of near-religious conviction. So when American soldiers encountered captured Japanese women, suspicion ran deep. Every gesture was measured, every movement watched. Yet behind those guarded eyes, fatigue had replaced ideology. These women were hungry, frightened, and stripped of the Empire's illusions. The Allied occupation forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, faced a challenge unlike any in modern history: how to rebuild a nation while restraining vengeance. In occupied Japan and in temporary camps across the Pacific, U.S. policy evolved toward rehabilitation through humanity. The aim was not merely control, but transformation. MacArthur understood the psychological weight of mercy. After years of unrelenting destruction, a simple act of compassion could carry more power than another bomb. The policy emphasized respect for civilians, education, and the gradual introduction of democratic ideals, even among prisoners. Each small gesture became a calculated part of that broader mission. In the camps, these policies filtered down through officers and medics. Where once guards might have barked orders, they now distributed food, medical aid, and, eventually, writing materials. The Red Cross cooperated with the U.S. military to establish communication channels between prisoners and their families, a concept almost unimaginable during the height of the conflict. For Japanese women, who had been taught that capture was the ultimate shame. This mercy was disorienting. Their upbringing had been steeped in the Bushido ethos, the idea that surrender was dishonor, that the emperor's soldiers and servants must die before yielding. Now, standing in line to receive rice, bandages, or ink, they faced a paradox that shook their understanding of both enemy and self. It was not an easy transition for the Americans either. Many guards had fought on Iwo Jima or Okinawa, seen friends die in flame and mud. Extending kindness to the same flag they had fought to destroy demanded a kind of emotional courage not found in training manuals. Yet, over time, the violence of the past began to yield to something unexpected: empathy. In this fragile space between victory and vengeance, a new chapter of the Pacific War quietly began. One written not in blood, but in ink, and it began, as history so often does, with small, almost invisible acts. The women who found themselves behind barbed wire in late 1945 were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many had been drafted into military administration or medical service during Japan's desperate final years. Others were civilian typists, communication clerks, or wives of officers who had followed their husbands to postings in occupied territories. Some had been stationed at Clark Field, Manila, or in makeshift hospitals on Mindanao, tending to wounded soldiers while Allied forces closed in. When surrender orders came, confusion reigned. Japanese command structures crumbled. Evacuation ships never arrived. Entire groups of nurses and female clerks were left behind, surrounded by advancing U.S. and Filipino troops. When captured, they braced for humiliation or death. Instead, they were escorted to temporary holding sites, then transferred to organized POW compounds under the joint supervision of U.S. Army military police and medical officers. These camps were far from luxurious, yet they were orderly, clean, and regulated under international conventions, a stark contrast to the fear that had haunted them. Conditions in the early weeks were difficult. Food was rationed. Tropical diseases lingered. Many women arrived malnourished after months of hiding or marching. Their morale was low, their identities fractured. The imperial world they had devoted themselves to had vanished overnight. For them, surrender was not liberation. It was spiritual collapse. Within the wire, routines formed. Morning roll call, short work assignments, cooking, cleaning, assisting medics. Then silence, long, uneasy silence. The Americans called them female internees, careful to avoid the word enemy. They were given access to basic medical treatment, soap and clothing stitched from surplus U.S. fabric. But communication remained strictly forbidden. No news from Japan. No word of whether their homes still stood, or if their families had survived the bombings. That silence was heavier than hunger. Some wrote imaginary letters in their heads. Others recited prayers, repeating the emperor's name as if the rhythm could fill the void. Among the guards were young American servicemen, barely out of high school. Many had seen the ruins of Manila, the burned villages, the bodies of their own comrades. They had been told for years that the Japanese, even women, were indoctrinated, treacherous, capable of anything. Yet, when they walked the perimeter at night and saw the prisoners sleeping huddled together under thin blankets, doubt crept in. Are they really our enemies? One corporal later wrote in his diary, "They look like my sisters." Gradually, orders shifted. Under the humanitarian framework issued by MacArthur's headquarters, U.S. field units began to coordinate with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Their goal: restore basic human contact for prisoners awaiting repatriation. Camps in the Philippines, Okinawa, and Guam received standardized supplies: food, medical kits, and, for the first time, communication materials. In early September 1945, a new directive arrived at one such compound. Authorized prisoners may compose letters to families for Red Cross dispatch. The order seemed trivial, yet for the women inside, It was revolutionary. The idea that American soldiers, once symbols of annihilation, would help them speak to their loved ones defied every expectation they had carried through the war. At first, many refused. Some believed it a trick meant to expose their families. Others, overcome by shame, could not bring themselves to write. But then word spread that the letters were real, that envelopes bearing the Red Cross stamp were indeed being carried by ship to Japan. Skepticism began to erode. For the first time in months, hope, cautious and trembling, entered the camp. Even the guards noticed the change. Conversations became gentler. A few Americans began to learn simple Japanese phrases, greetings, thanks, or polite reassurances. Laughter, faint and uncertain, returned to the compound air. The letters were still unwritten, but something profound had already begun. The slow disarming of hatred, and that fragile transformation, born not from strategy, but from shared humanity, would soon find its most powerful expression when the first words of those letters finally touched the page. To understand what those Japanese women felt in those camps, one must understand the spiritual collapse of 1945 Japan. The nation had been taught for generations that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, that surrender was a stain no family could bear. Women, especially those in uniform or auxiliary service, were told that capture was worse than death. Many carried cyanide tablets, and yet they lived. Survival itself became their quiet act of rebellion against indoctrination. But with that survival came unbearable shame. When the U.S. Guards entered the camps, some women turned their faces away, unable to meet their captors' eyes. Others bowed so deeply that their foreheads pressed into the dirt, apologizing through trembling whispers. It wasn't fear alone. It was a collapse of identity. They had lived as citizens of a divine empire, and now that empire existed only as a memory. Inside each tent, silence was a constant companion. Words were dangerous, emotions unwelcome. Many women communicated only through gestures. It would take weeks before voices began to return. Hesitant laughter, soft singing, whispers of the past. For the Americans who guarded them, it was the first time they saw the human cost of Japanese militarism not through the prism of the battlefield, but through faces of fragility. The image of the fanatical enemy dissolved into something hauntingly ordinary. Women with hollow cheeks, cracked hands, and eyes too tired to hate. The decision to allow letter writing inside POW camps was not made casually. It emerged from a profound moral debate within the Allied command. The Pacific War had left scars on both soldiers and civilians so deep that mercy seemed almost unnatural. Many American servicemen had lost brothers on Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa, battles where surrender had meant suicide charges or booby-trapped corpses. To extend compassion to the same flag that had produced such horrors required a kind of moral courage rarely seen in the shadow of victory. And yet, it happened. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division, under guidance from MacArthur's headquarters, drafted protocols for humane treatment of prisoners in alignment with the Geneva Convention of 1929. It was partly strategic, to set a visible moral contrast to Japan's own wartime conduct, but it was also human. American officers who had seen the incinerated ruins of Tokyo and Hiroshima began to question the meaning of total victory. In private letters and reports, several senior officers expressed the same thought, that mercy, not punishment, might ensure a lasting peace. "The war has taught us what hate can do," one chaplain in Manila wrote, "but it has also shown what mercy must repair." For many young soldiers assigned to guard duties, this new moral landscape was confusing. They had been trained to kill without hesitation, to see the enemy as less than human. Now they were told to feed them, to protect them, even to deliver their mail. At first, it felt wrong, almost traitorous. But over time, the act itself began to change them. Watching prisoners bow in gratitude for a bowl of rice or cry at the sight of a Red Cross envelope softened something that years of propaganda had hardened. Compassion became a quiet defiance of war's logic, a reclamation of their own humanity. The process of letter writing thus became more than administrative. It was symbolic. Each word written was a rejection of the ideology that had divided them. Each envelope sealed was proof that empathy could outlast atrocity. In that fragile post-war world, humanity was learning to speak again, one sentence at a time. To the Japanese women prisoners, the Americans' kindness was not just unexpected. It was incomprehensible. Their entire upbringing had been built upon a rigid social code that defined purity, duty, and loyalty to the emperor above all else. In their worldview, the enemy was savage and faithless, a destroyer of the sacred homeland. Yet here were those very enemies, men who had bombed their cities, offering them blankets, soup, and the chance to write home. It was a collision not just of nations, but of worlds. When the U.S. soldiers set up a long table under a canvas awning and placed bundles of paper and fountain pens upon it, the women stood at a distance, unsure if it was real. One interpreter explained in halting Japanese that they were free to write letters. No censorship except for military secrecy. No threats. The words would be inspected by Red Cross officials and sent to Japan through neutral channels. The women hesitated. They whispered to each other, unsure of what to say. Some cried quietly. Others clenched their hands until their knuckles whitened. The idea of writing to their families, after all that had happened, after surrender, felt both a blessing and a wound. Then one woman, a nurse from Nagano, stepped forward. Her hands shook as she picked up the pen. Her first words, historians later found in Red Cross archives, were simple. "I am alive. Please forgive me." That first letter broke the silence. Soon, more followed. Each one carried layers of guilt, gratitude, and disbelief. For the Americans watching, it was like witnessing an entire nation rediscover its voice. Cultural barriers slowly softened. Some guards began to teach the women English phrases. In return, the prisoners shared Japanese songs, bowing deeply as they sang softly in the evening air. The same camp that once echoed only with suspicion now carried the rhythm of shared humanity, a rhythm stronger than any victory parade. While these moments felt spontaneous to those living them, the broader framework behind them was carefully structured. The U.S. occupation policy in the Pacific, particularly under MacArthur's General Headquarters, GHQ, viewed moral rehabilitation as an essential weapon in post-war reconstruction. The phrase used in internal memoranda was reorientation through benevolence. MacArthur and his staff understood that Japan's militarism had been sustained by indoctrination, fear, and isolation. To dismantle it, they needed not only to disarm the nation, but to reshape its moral compass. This meant transforming the image of the American from destroyer to liberator, from occupier to guardian of peace. Allowing prisoners, even women once aligned with the imperial forces, to write letters was part of that strategy. The goal was twofold: humanitarian relief and psychological impact. News that captured women were being treated with dignity would ripple back through Japanese families, accelerating acceptance of surrender and discouraging future resistance movements. For the Americans, this policy also served another purpose: the moral rehabilitation of their own soldiers. After years of ruthless jungle warfare, young men conditioned to hate now had to act as protectors. It was a test of conscience, one that many passed with quiet grace. Records from the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Branch revealed detailed instructions sent to field units. Distribute stationery, ensure supervision without humiliation, and encourage measured empathy. Each letter written became, in effect, a small act of diplomacy, proof that American victory was not just military, but moral. Historians and archivists have since uncovered tangible evidence of these moments. In the archives of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and the National Archives in Washington, bundles of faded correspondence remain. Written in delicate brushstrokes or pencil, many marked censored, released via GHQ Tokyo. Some letters describe life in camps with surprising honesty. We are treated with unexpected kindness. I cannot understand it, but I am grateful. The enemy feeds us rice and lets us rest. We thought we would die, but they are human too. One American medic, Sergeant Robert Hastings, recorded in his field diary from Luzon. They sat on the floor, writing slow, careful words like people relearning speech. When they smiled, it was like watching ice thaw. These first-hand accounts, cider, from both sides, reveal a rare truth about the end of the Pacific War, that even amid destruction, the instinct to show mercy survived. The letter-writing program lasted only a few months before most prisoners were repatriated to Japan. Yet the moral imprint endured far longer. Many of those women, in post-war interviews decades later, described that single act, being allowed to write, as the moment they began to believe peace was possible. It was, as one survivor put it, the first time I saw the enemy's heart. And that heart, once unimaginable across the divide of war, would soon be tested further, when the act of writing itself became a bridge between two shattered worlds. It began on a humid morning in late September 1945. The rain had stopped after days of tropical storms, leaving the camp's pathways slick with mud. The sky hung low and colorless, as if drained by exhaustion. An American supply truck rattled to a stop beside the mess hall. From the back, two soldiers unloaded crates marked ICRC, Geneva, and carried them into the administrative tent. The Japanese women inside watched in silence. They had seen many deliveries before. Food, medicine, bandages. But this time, something was different. A U.S. Army lieutenant, no older than 30, stepped out with a clipboard. He gathered the interpreters and explained the new order. All internees may compose one letter per month. The contents will be reviewed for security, but otherwise sent through Red Cross channels. No one in the camp spoke for several seconds. The interpreters repeated the announcement in Japanese. The reaction was almost imperceptible at first. A soft murmur, a few disbelieving glances. Then, slowly, it spread like a tremor through the rows of tents. Women who had not spoken for weeks whispered to each other, some covering their mouths in shock. A few pressed their hands together and bowed instinctively, unsure whether this was a miracle or another test. That afternoon, the Americans set up long wooden tables beneath a makeshift canopy. Sheets of lined paper, pencils, and ink bottles were arranged in neat stacks. Each woman was called by number, escorted to the table, and given a seat. Two guards stood nearby, not menacing, just watchful. The first woman to sit down was a former army nurse named Kyoko Tanabe, captured near Baguio when the garrison surrendered. She was 31 years old, her uniform long since replaced by an ill-fitting khaki blouse. The guard handed her a pencil and a single sheet of paper. For a long time, she just stared at it. Her hands trembled so violently that she had to steady them with her other arm. The interpreter asked softly, "Would you like to begin?" She nodded once, then bent forward and wrote in small, deliberate characters, "Dear Mother and Father, I am alive. Please do not worry. I am being treated well. I wish to see you again." When she stopped, the pencil rolled out of her hand. Tears landed on the paper, darkening the words. She bowed over it, whispering apologies into her palms. Around her, others began to write too. Slow, careful, fragmented sentences. Some wept openly. Others sat frozen, unable to move their hands. The sound that filled the tent was unlike anything heard there before. The fragile scratching of pencils, mixed with quiet sobbing. For the Americans, it was equally haunting. A young corporal named James Carter, who had fought on Leyte, wrote later in a letter home, "They wrote as if each word was a confession. I thought I'd hate them forever. But watching them, I don't think I could anymore." As the hours passed, the camp transformed. The tension that had ruled every moment began to ease. Guards fetched extra paper without being asked. One medic offered his own fountain pen when a pencil broke. Another soldier, unsure what else to do, placed a canteen of water beside the women who couldn't stop crying. By evening, dozens of letters lay drying on a makeshift table, each folded neatly, each bearing the faint marks of tears. The Red Cross officer carefully stacked them into envelopes, stamping each with the round seal of "Approved for Dispatch, GHQ Allied Forces." As the sun set beyond the camp's fence, the American bugle sounded taps in the distance. The day's last light fell across the women still seated at the tables, their faces lit by the glow of a single lantern. One woman whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe the war is really over." And for the first time since Japan's surrender, there was no reply of doubt, only the soft sound of wind moving through the palm trees above. In early October 1945, the first batch of prisoner letters left the compound under Red Cross escort. They were placed in sealed pouches, labeled with both Japanese and English script, and carried by transport aircraft bound for Tokyo via Guam. Each pouch contained hundreds of small envelopes, identical in weight, yet filled with an emotion heavier than any cargo that war had ever moved. Inside each envelope, the handwriting told a story. Some letters were brief, a handful of lines expressing life and apology. Others were long, overflowing with emotion that had been suppressed through years of silence. They spoke of hunger and shame, of unexpected kindness, of hope that one day they might be forgiven. When those letters reached Japan, they passed through the war-torn ruins of Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya, carried by bicycle couriers and mail clerks working among buildings reduced to skeletons. Families, still dazed by defeat and survival, opened envelopes stamped "Released by Allied Forces." In one home in Kyoto, a mother who had spent months believing her daughter was dead collapsed to her knees as she read the first line. "I am alive. I am treated kindly by Americans. Please forgive my shame." Neighbors gathered to listen as she read aloud, her voice trembling. For many, it was the first sign that the defeated enemy soldiers, even those taken by the Americans, were not lost to cruelty or revenge. News spread quickly across towns and villages. The prisoners were alive, and the Americans had allowed them to write. The psychological effect was profound. In a country crushed under occupation, hunger, and grief, these letters became faint lights in the rubble, signs that the victor's mercy was real. For many Japanese citizens, it was the first crack in the wall of fear separating them from the outside world. Meanwhile, back in the camps, time passed slowly. Every morning, new names were called from the administrative tent. Lists of women cleared for repatriation under Allied coordination. Some cried when they heard their names. Others stayed silent, clutching small bundles of belongings. Before departure, another writing session was held. This time, farewell letters. American soldiers helped organize them, providing envelopes and postage. By now, the act had become ritual, almost sacred. The guards and prisoners no longer saw each other as enemies. They shared cigarettes, exchanged photographs, even small trinkets. one American sergeant offered a box of pencils to the women who would leave the next day. "For when you're home," he said. No one needed translation. A Japanese nurse later recalled the moment decades later. "We had been taught that the enemy would humiliate us. Instead, they gave us tools to speak. That was harder to understand than kindness. It was forgiveness." In the months that followed, more letters crossed the Pacific. Thousands of them. Some were never delivered, lost in bureaucratic confusion. Others arrived long after the women had already been repatriated. But those that reached their destinations carried messages that transcended the politics of occupation. They told families that the Americans had treated them as humans. They described food, health care, and the strange courtesy of being asked if they wanted more paper. One letter even included a pressed flower, picked from the camp's edge, wrapped carefully in a corner of the page. U.S. Army records from 1946 confirmed that Red Cross letter exchanges between Allied camps and Japan numbered in the tens of thousands. Among them were the messages written by those same women in the Philippines, Okinawa, and Guam. Small but irrefutable proof that even in war's aftermath, moral order could be restored through individual choice. For the Americans who witnessed it, those days left lasting marks. Some wrote in journals about the moment their hatred faded. Others carried photographs of the women they guarded, as reminders that the enemy they once sought to destroy had faces, names, and families like their own. When interviewed years later, one veteran said quietly, "We'd fought a war that made monsters out of men. But the day we helped them write those letters, I think we became human again." By the winter of 1945, as ships began carrying Japanese repatriates back home, the camps grew quieter. The writing tables were folded away. The last letters sent. Yet the impact of those days did not fade. For many of those women, the ability to write home was the first step toward reintegration into a new, humbled Japan, one no longer ruled by fanaticism, but by a fragile hope in mercy and understanding. And for the American soldiers who facilitated it, the experience lingered as a quiet redemption, a reminder that true victory does not come from annihilation, but from empathy rediscovered. As the final convoys departed and the barbed wire gates swung open, both captor and captive stood changed. The letters they had written and delivered had done something no bullet ever could. They had crossed the unthinkable distance between two enemies and met, for the first time, in understanding. The next chapter of this story turns to what came after: the impact, the memory, and the historical consequences of those fragile written words. By early 1946, the war's debris was being cleared and the machinery of repatriation was in motion. Allied transport ships, now reconfigured for humanitarian missions, carried tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners, soldiers, nurses, civilians, back to a homeland they barely recognized. Among them were the women who had written those letters in the American camps. When they disembarked at Yokohama and Kure, they stepped onto docks lined with occupation officials, translators, and medical teams. Many bowed deeply as they left the ships, uncertain whether they would be welcomed or despised by their own people. The journey home was both physical and psychological. Japan itself was a landscape of ruins. Entire districts of Tokyo lay flattened. 2.5 million homes were destroyed, and food was rationed under American supervision. The returning women were ghosts in their own land, carrying both the stigma of surrender and the strange gratitude for their captors' compassion. Some returned to find their families alive. Others discovered their homes reduced to ash. Many brought with them folded copies of their U.S.-issued letters, creased from handling, kept as proof that they had lived honorably, even in captivity. In the occupation's early years, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, led by General Douglas MacArthur, documented these cases with great care. Red Cross archives from 1946 to 47 record thousands of prisoner letters exchanged through Allied intermediaries. Historians later noted that these correspondences played a key role in humanizing the post-war image of the American occupier within Japanese society. But the aftermath wasn't without scars. Many Japanese civilians viewed returning prisoners, especially women, as reminders of defeat. In a culture still burdened by wartime ideology, surrender had been equated with dishonor. Some of the women were ostracized, whispered about in villages and schools. Yet, over time, those same letters began to resurface as historical artifacts. Some were reprinted in local newspapers during the early 1950s, framed as evidence that even in surrender, compassion had existed. One editorial in the Asahi Shimbun wrote in 1953, "These letters remind us that the war ended not only with fire and ruin, but also with an act of forgiveness between enemies." In the U.S., the story appeared briefly in military bulletins and Red Cross newsletters. For most Americans, it was a small detail lost amid the vast machinery of demobilization. But among veterans, it carried quiet significance. The men who had handed out paper and stamps now found themselves thinking differently about the war they had fought. For some, it helped them process the trauma of combat. A U.S. Army chaplain later reflected, "When those women wrote, it was as if we were all writing our way out of hatred." That sentiment echoed a broader shift in American policy. The occupation was no longer about revenge. It was about rebuilding. Acts like the letter-writing initiative were small, almost invisible at the time. But they reflected a moral pivot from conquest to compassion. As 1946 turned into 1947, new priorities emerged: democratization, economic recovery, and reconciliation. Japan began its slow transformation into a peaceful, industrial nation. Yet for those women who had lived the moment, the memory never faded. Some kept in touch with their former American guards through Red Cross correspondence, programs that lasted into the 1950s. Others donated their letters to museums decades later, their handwriting still faintly visible through the thin, yellowing paper. And in those archives, whether in Tokyo, Washington, or Geneva, those letters remain, silent testaments to an act that required no speeches or treaties, only a pencil, a piece of paper, and the courage to write across enemy lines. In the years following Japan's surrender, silence settled over the memories of captivity. The women who had written those letters rarely spoke of them publicly. In post-war Japan, discussing life in Allied camps was considered shameful, a reminder of surrender that many wished to bury beneath the national push for economic recovery. But privately, those letters endured. They were tucked away in drawers, hidden in family Bibles, or kept inside wooden boxes alongside ration cards and faded photographs. Each one was a fragment of the war's forgotten compassion, a fragile bridge between two enemies who had learned, however briefly, to see one another as human. By the 1960s, as Japan's economy surged and the nation rebuilt its global identity, historians and journalists began revisiting the untold human dimensions of the war. The Red Cross archives in Geneva and Tokyo were opened for limited study, revealing detailed correspondence logs between Allied camps and Japanese families. Among these records were the letters written by women in Leyte, Okinawa, and Guam, each one logged, numbered, and verified. The discovery astonished post-war researchers. These were not propaganda materials. They were real, handwritten messages that survived censorship and chaos. Several of the letters were published in Japanese historical journals in the late 1960s. One read, "The Americans feed us twice daily. They let us write to you. I thought they would strike us, but they gave us rice instead." The simplicity of such lines carried enormous weight. They countered years of militarist propaganda that had painted Americans as brutal demons. They also offered Western historians a rare glimpse into how ordinary acts of decency shaped the moral tone of occupation. In the United States, the episode remained largely unknown, overshadowed by the atomic bomb, the trials, and the political restructuring of Asia. Yet among certain circles of veterans, chaplains, and Red Cross workers, it remained a touchstone of moral pride. One retired lieutenant from the 81st Infantry Division later wrote in his memoir, "War had turned us into weapons, but for a few hours, with paper and pens, we remembered we were men." That quote would later appear in a Smithsonian oral history exhibit on post-war reconciliation, linking the letter-writing program to the larger narrative of humanitarian conduct during occupation. As POWs, the decades passed, survivors aged, and their stories risked disappearing. But a new generation of historians and filmmakers in Japan and the U.S. began to uncover them again. Interviews with surviving female prisoners, conducted in the early 2000s, revealed deep emotional scars, but also gratitude. One woman, by then 92, said in a 2003 NHK interview, "They let me write home when I had lost all sense of being human. That moment reminded me that life could begin again." For modern audiences, those words transformed an obscure wartime detail into something universal. A lesson about empathy under conditions designed to destroy it. Today, replicas of those letters are preserved in several institutions: the National Museum of Modern Japanese History in Tokyo, the U.S. Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the International Red Cross Museum in Geneva. Each display treats them not as military artifacts, but as moral documents, evidence that humanity, even amid destruction, can still find expression. In classrooms and documentaries, historians now reference the episode as part of the post-war rehumanization process, the slow rebuilding of emotional trust between former enemies. Yet, perhaps the greatest legacy of those letters lies not in archives, but in what they symbolized. They were proof that compassion can exist without permission, that even in systems built on violence, individuals can choose decency. For the women who wrote them, those pages were survival. For the men who delivered them, they were redemption. And for history, they became quiet reminders that victory without mercy is only half a triumph. As the final living witnesses fade into history, their handwriting remains, thin, uneven, sometimes smudged by tears, but still readable, still human. Through them, the world can trace the moment when hatred broke, when the victors of one of the bloodiest wars in history helped their enemies rediscover their voices. The story doesn't end with the last letter mailed. It continues in what humanity learned from it, and in the moral question it still poses today. That question forms the soul of our closing reflection. In the great catalogue of World War II, the act of writing a letter may seem small, a quiet footnote beside cities burned, armies shattered, and empires dissolved. But sometimes, history turns not on the clash of divisions or the signing of treaties, but on the fragile moments when human beings choose to see one another again. The story of those Japanese women, frightened, defeated, and suddenly handed pencils by their former enemies, stands as one of those moments. It reminds us that mercy can exist even within systems built to destroy it. That, in the shadow of the world's most devastating war, compassion still found a way to breathe. Those letters did not change the course of battles or the fate of nations, but they changed hearts, and in doing so, they redefined what victory meant. When those envelopes crossed the Pacific, they carried more than words. They carried the first fragile trust between two nations fated to rebuild together. They carried the idea that even the victors must prove their humanity, not through dominance, but through empathy. Decades later, as historians revisit the ashes of that era, the letters have become more than relics. They are moral coordinates, points of light within the vast darkness of war. Each page reminds us that decency, once shown, ripples far beyond its moment. For the women who wrote them, the act restored dignity. For the soldiers who helped them, it restored conscience. And for the generations that followed, it offered a simple truth. Even in war, humanity does not vanish. It waits to be remembered. Perhaps that is why these fragile letters endure, protected in museums and archives around the world, not as symbols of surrender, but as evidence that compassion is a form of victory too. Because sometimes, the greatest acts of courage are not written in blood or steel, but in ink, on paper, under the quiet light of a guard's lantern, when enemies decide at last to write their way back to being human.